So, ladies and gentlemen, here we are live on Facebook with Harley Schlanger. I have interviewed Harley in the past a few times and found him to be an expert on various subjects on having to do with world affairs. And I have done 2 or 3 programs on Robert Mueller in the past, in the last few months. And I spotted him at the time to be an apparatchik who was working for the deep state, if you will, in an attempt to undermine Trump and, in fact, set up his impeachment. So that was my personal opinion, backed by a few different things I'd looked at. But now we have a real expert on the line who can give us some of the history of, all of the history of Robert Mueller and the dirty business, treasonous affairs that he has been up to over the years. And I rank him with Chertoff and Zelikow as a very important apparatchik for the deep state. And I can point to various events in history that were turning points, I believe. And I'm sure Robert Mueller will talk about those. So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you wish, and go right into the story of Robert Mueller.
Okay, well, it's good to be with you again, Jim. It's been a while. And I am a spokesman for Lyndon LaRouche and have been since 1999. And in that capacity, I represent him in LaRouche PAC, but also I write for the Executive Intelligence Review. And for the last little more than a year, I've been living in Berlin, Germany with my family, where I'm operating out of our Berlin office. I'm still Mr. LaRouche's national spokesman in the United States, but we also are expanding our operations internationally. There's a real need, as I'm sure you know, for breaking through the fake news on both sides of the Atlantic. So there's no lack of work to be done. Now, we have a particular view of Mueller that goes back to personal experience, because Mueller's role as an operative for the deep state first appears in the mid-1980s. And it was in his involvement in the case of the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche. And let me give you a little background to this, but to tell your listeners, we have written a dossier. One of my colleagues in Leesburg, Virginia, who's a legal expert, Barbara Boyd, has written a dossier called Robert Mueller is a legal, I think an immoral legal assassin, and he will do his job if you let him. And she identifies 3 moments in Mueller's history. And the first one is the LaRouche case. Now, for those who are not familiar with Lyndon LaRouche, who's been a target of slander and harassment from the deep state going back to the 70s, in the early 1980s, he was brought in by Ronald Reagan to negotiate with the Russians. That is, LaRouche was asked to speak to the Russians about an idea that LaRouche had, which became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, so-called Star Wars. But LaRouche's idea, which Reagan supported, was that the United States and the Russians should jointly develop it, since the Russians were doing work on it, and that it should be deployed by both countries simultaneously, so that neither would have an advantage of being able to knock down the other side's incoming missiles. And LaRouche's idea of strategic defense was an anti-missile defense system based on lasers, X-ray technologies, satellites, and so on. New physical principles, which the Russians were working on, as were we. And Reagan liked it, because unlike today's neoconservatives who want to go to war with Russia, Reagan didn't want to go to war with Russia. He thought that the solution was a military buildup, but he liked the idea of having a defensive missile system that would be shared. Now, certain people didn't like that, namely the same people who are tied to the military-industrial complex, the defense sector, and of course the neocons who love war, not even from monetary purposes, but because they're crazy. They believe in a unipolar world that should be enforced by U.S. military strength. And so LaRouche's influence on the Reagan administration was a threat to them. and it was a threat that was expressed from British intelligence, which sent a letter to the head of counterintelligence of the FBI in 1982, demanding that the FBI do something to stop LaRouche. And the FBI response, which we have, is that while we have no evidence that LaRouche is on a Russian payroll, he could very well be acting to change U.S. policy to benefit Russia, and we will investigate him. And that was the beginning of the Get LaRouche Task Force, which at the time was run by people like George Herbert Walker Bush, the vice president, Henry Kissinger, and people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democratic senator from New York. It soon became a legal case after the 1986 election, when William Weld, who at the time was the U.S. attorney from Boston, was assigned the Get LaRouche leadership. And Weld brought onto his staff a man named Robert Mueller. Now, shortly after that, Weld was brought into the Justice Department at a higher level, and Mueller took over the Get LaRouche Task Force. And he came up with a story that LaRouche was defrauding supporters, was stealing money on credit cards, was committing fraud, and he eventually brought an indictment in Boston, Massachusetts. When it went to trial, at a certain point, the judge ordered a searching of George Herbert Walker Bush's personal safe, and it turned up material from Oliver North and others attacking LaRouche. And the judge, John Keaton, declared a mistrial and accused Mueller of prosecutorial misconduct in the case against LaRouche. Sound familiar, huh?
Oh, yeah. Well, it shows the thoroughness of their ability to take anyone down, and if they can't do it that way.
And I can pick up on the question of Mueller's role in the LaRouche case, because what he did after the judge threw it out of court, there was a poll taken by the Boston Herald which showed that the jurors, had they brought the case to fruition at that point, it would have been a 12-0 acquittal of LaRouche, and people expressed their concern with the tactics of the prosecutor, namely Mueller. So what he did is he passed it off to Alexandria, Virginia, and they changed the terms of the indictment. The second indictment against LaRouche was centered around, and this will sound familiar, conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service.
Al Capone.
And that's why they sent Lyndon LaRouche to prison with a 15-year term. Mm-hmm. Now, throughout that, Mueller arrested 6 other LaRouche collaborators and offered them plea deals. But he said to them, if you don't take a plea deal, you'll end up with jail time from the case we're doing here, but you'll also be tried in state court, which later happened, and some of my associates were given 60, 70, 80-year sentences, which were later commuted by the Virginia legal system. But Mueller was trying to destroy our organization based on the demand to the FBI from British intelligence to shut down LaRouche, and more importantly, shut down LaRouche's impact on Reagan. Now, the next time Mueller becomes prominent that we identify in the dossier is around 9/11, because he became FBI director shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Can we go back chronologically? We've got Oklahoma City and BCCI as well, but if you want to jump to 9/11, that's okay.
Well, you can. I'm just going through what's in our dossier. We have we have 3 cases. One is the LaRouche case, one is the 9/11, and then one is the Trump case.
Right. All right. I'm
not that familiar with what role he played with Oklahoma City and BCCI. But in terms of the 9/11 case, there are 2 aspects to it that are important. One is the congressional investigation into what happened. which was headed by Senator Bob Graham, a Florida Democrat. And Graham reported the constant efforts of the FBI to hide evidence, to hide witnesses, and he said he was asked if Mueller was engaged in a cover-up. And he said, cover-up, no, it was more than that. It was aggressive deception.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, at the same time, just as an example, they found later 80,000 pages of FBI documents on the cell in Sarasota that was supposedly involved in the 9/11 hijackings that the FBI said didn't exist.
Okay.
They finally produced them.
And by the way, listeners should probably know that I did a program with the Florida Bulldog, Daniel Christensen, and I told him at the time that his investigation would be quashed as well. And indeed, what they did was they set up a commission to stop him from following evidence, and that commission was headed by, are you ready for this? Edward Meese. So that's, I don't know how deep the barrel is of traitors, but to have to drag out Edward Meese to stop Daniel Christensen was a pretty interesting maneuver, I thought. But anyway, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Well, and Jim, Christensen, in keeping with the name Bulldog, kept at it. Mm-hmm. And he's one of the heroes in this because of the work that he did exposing the cover-up that was being run directly by Mueller. And to get to your question, how deep the barrel is, it's not that deep. There aren't that many of these really evil characters. Mm-hmm. You have to keep recycling them.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Back. Yeah.
Now, the other part of the post-9/11 that Mueller was absolutely instrumental in was setting up the surveillance state. And his role, as Bill Binney and Ray McGovern and others have reported, was that he provided cover for what the NSA was doing, which we later found out through the work of Edward Snowden. But that Mueller repeatedly told the Congress that the FBI has no program to surveil the American citizens, just as James Clapper did when he lied to Congress some years later.
Yeah.
But Mueller played an extremely important role during that period in ensuring that all of us would have our internet access and our phone records collected as part of a metadata collection, which Mueller said was necessary to protect the nation. Now, Mueller also had a role in the cover-up of what was going on at Gitmo and Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The FBI was involved to some extent in the cover-up of the torture through collaboration with the CIA. And then you just move forward to the present period, and what you see is that Comey played a continuing role as an ally of Mueller, and that James Comey, who was the FBI director fired by Trump, was working very closely with Clapper and with John Brennan. They said 17 intelligence agencies were investigating Russian meddling and hacking and Trump collusion. It was really a grouping around Comey, Clapper, and Brennan.
And that's why Clapper and Brennan were so enthusiastic about Robert Mueller getting the position of special prosecutor.
Well, and Clapper is completely unhinged, and I can get to that in a moment. But the important thing is then you look at how this operation was run against Trump and why. And, a lot of people know there's something fishy about it. I mean, here we've had a year, and there's been no hard evidence produced of Russian meddling, Russian hacking, or Trump collusion. And as Bill Binney pointed out at an event in New York City not that long ago, the NSA would know immediately if there had been hacking in the United States. They would have tracked it. Hacking of a file as large as the emails that were taken from Podesta and the Democratic National Committee. So there was no hacking, as the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPs, reported, Binney, Ray McGovern, and others. There's no hacking. And what they also said is that there was evidence that to cover up the charge of hacking, that probably the CIA, using Cyrillic codes, introduced that into the computers to make it look as though there had been a hack. Whereas we know with pretty good certainty that rather than a hack, there was a leak from within the DNC. Now, we should get to that in a moment, because the Donna Brazil revelations of the last 24 hours are really quite interesting.
Yeah.
Get at this whole picture. So,
and it's one of the first that actually got mainstream coverage.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole thing's blowing up. Because with all the effort they've put in, they have nothing except this Papadopoulos guy.
Yeah.
We can get to him in a moment also.
Right, what a character.
Well, as David Stockman referred to him as Baby George. Here's a guy with no credentials. He actually was working with neocon think tanks, the Jamestown Foundation and the Hudson Institute, writing anti-Russian stuff. And then all of a sudden he shows up on Trump's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee, pushing for meetings with the Russians based on a very shady character, a professor, who he claims told him that he could get access to dirt on Hillary Clinton. But I want to come back to that in a moment, because I think the most important thing that we can add in terms of the Mueller dossier is this whole question of what it is about Trump that they're trying to stop. It's not that they don't like Trump, or they think he's crude or rude, or even that they think he'll get us into a nuclear war. Their opposition to Trump goes back to the intention of keeping Hillary, or electing Hillary president. You could continue the policy of regime change, eastward expansion of NATO against Russia, and the confrontation with China in the South China Sea. And that's because Hillary Clinton was a continuation of the Bush and Obama policy of maintaining the unipolar world under the direction of an Anglo-American political, financial, and strategic establishment. And that whatever else Trump is, he recognized that that was getting us in trouble. That he spoke during his campaign against Wall Street, he spoke against regime change, he spoke against sanctions with Russia, and he said it would be good for us to be talking with Putin. Whereas Hillary was basically saying, we need a no-fly zone in Syria to keep the Russians out, and if necessary, to shoot down Russian planes.
And the generals told Obama, and Obama agreed, thank goodness, that that could provoke another war.
Yeah, a possible nuclear war, sure.
Yeah.
But I think that Obama was willing to go to the edge on that, because at the same time, he was continuing the Bush policy of placing anti-missile systems in Romania and Poland, trying to bring countries like Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Obama played a very important role in supporting Hillary Clinton's regime change operation in Libya, in Ukraine, and also in Syria.
Yeah, the balkanization of Syria as well, and the regime change of Assad.
Yeah, and that was Hillary and Obama, and it was Samantha Power at the United Nations. It was Susan Rice, the protege of Albright, who was a protege of Brzezinski. You had on both parties, both sides, an alliance with the neocons. Victoria Nuland, who was on the ground coordinating the Ukraine coup. Her husband was eating with Obama once a month for secret dinners in the White House. And Hillary made sure that Nuland stayed on as the Secretary of State for Eastern European Affairs. So you had this neocon control in both parties. And Trump's election was a threat to that. And importantly, Trump recognized that working with Russia would be a better way to defeat the terrorists in Syria than fighting against them, fighting against the Russians, opposing the Russians. And we've seen the effectiveness of the Russian deployment against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. So the decision was made very early on. And also the other point, and this is something people, again, probably have forgotten, but during the campaign, Trump spoke about going after Wall Street and doing it through restoring Glass-Steagall. And this is crucial because Glass-Steagall, the separation of banks between commercial and investment banks, would mean that no banks would be able to risk depositors' income in their speculative investments. And it would have put a big damper on everything that's been done since 1999 to create large pools of liquidity, which include depositors' money that are going into a global speculative casino. Now, Trump is shooting himself in the foot on this one by having people like Mnuchin from Goldman Sachs and Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs on his economic team. And he should go back to what he promised during the campaign. But the mere threat of Glass-Steagall and cooperation with Russia and China caused the deep state to go berserk. And they invented this whole story of the Russian meddling. Now, the two key pieces of evidence that show how desperate they've become. The first one is the attempt to cover up the role of this Fusion GPS company with the Christopher Steele dossier, the one that alleges that the former MI6 operative Christopher Steele had sources that told him that Putin had videotapes of Trump cavorting with prostitutes in a Moscow hotel and all kinds of salacious details from that, most of which have been proven to be completely absurd. But the Steele dossier was funded, it now turns out, by the Clinton campaign and the DNC. This just was revealed last week.
By Brazil?
Well, no, before dawn of Brazil. It was because Devin Nunes, the Republican congressman from California, and Grassley, the Republican senator from Iowa, kept demanding that the records of Fusion GPS be made available to show who funded it.
Oh, okay.
The first funding for it came from Paul Singer, who's a psychotic hedge fund operator who was part of the Bush machine. He was backing Rubio at the time.
Yeah, vulture capitalists.
Yeah, exactly, the vulture capitalists. But he wasn't there when Steele was brought in. That was done with funding from the Democratic Party. And Steele got 160-something thousand, but supposedly Fusion GPS had a contract for more than $10 million from the Democratic Party. They produced this dossier, which was delivered to Comey and by former British ambassador to Russia named Wood, who was working with the same company as Christopher Steele, the MI6 operative. It was delivered to the United States by John McCain, this dossier alleging Trump was being blackmailed by sexual videotapes by Putin. And this was the story that BuzzFeed broke, that Comey took to Trump essentially in a repeat of the old J. Edgar Hoover sexual blackmail threats, where Hoover used to go to political officials and said, if you get out of line, we have these audio tapes or videotapes of you having an affair, and your career will be finished. That's what we were told Comey did with his famous meeting in New York City at Trump Tower with Trump. And Trump told him, it's just not true. And then he asked Comey if he could go easy on Flynn. And, of course, we all heard about that side of it. We didn't hear about the Comey blackmail threats. When Trump rejected that and said he's going to do what he's going to do, he's going to keep trying to meet with Putin, this whole narrative of Russian meddling was spun out. And Hillary repeated it. The media has been nonstop on it. Republicans like McCain, Lindsey Graham have been going with it. The one party, the Wall Street party at the top, has been moving to try and throw Trump out. But now we're beginning to see the fuller picture, that Hillary Clinton was funding it. And not only that, we're seeing what was the subject of the emails that the Russians released, so supposedly the Russians released, which it's not even clear that it came from the Russians, to WikiLeaks. What was the subject? The DNC operations against Bernie Sanders, which was eclipsed by the story of, was it hacked?
Right.
Now, this is where the Brazil revelations come in. Because what Donna Brazil said in her book is that in August 2015, Hillary Clinton basically took over the Democratic National Committee by paying off some of the debts. And she signed an agreement with the DNC that she would provide $10 million to cover some of the debts of the DNC that were coming due, in return for which she would have basic control over financial decisions, who would be the spokespeople for the DNC, and what would be the policies of the DNC, Democratic National Committee. And we know from the WikiLeaks email drop that the DNC functioned against Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries and the convention. So it's now conclusive that Clinton was funding the production of the dossier against Trump. At the same time, she was running operations against Bernie Sanders through a takeover of the Democratic National Committee.
No.
Meanwhile, what was the content of this dossier and the activity that Mueller's doing to get Trump? That's where Papadopoulos comes in. Papadopoulos sounds like a classic British FBI sting operation. A probably ambitious twerp who tried to ingratiate himself with people by making up stories. And he told the Hudson Institute he's an energy consultant, and for a little while they had him on payroll, and then they just had him as a kind of researcher. He didn't do much with them. Then he, through LinkedIn, became a foreign policy advisor to Ben Carson, and anyone who knows much about Ben Carson's strategic thinking can see why this would be a perfect fit. You have a guy who's a nobody who's coming on now as a strategic advisor. But what's his background? London, London, London. The University of London, a master's degree, London School of Economics, master's degree, and then he became the director of a center in London for law and energy policy, which has its website shut down. It has an occasional conference. No one knows exactly what it is.
Well, let's remind people that we're talking about Papadopoulos, who is a supposed key witness that Robert Mueller is interested in order to work his destruction of Trump. But some of the watchers on Facebook would like to see you, and I just have to tell them that we had a minor breakup in the picture with Skype and some sound problems with Skype, so we decided to go purely with the telephone. So I'm sorry. If you go back to the beginning, you will see Harley Schlanger and the discussion that we began with him talking. But we had to give up on that and go with this. And perhaps we will do another one when we really have the technology in order, so we can see Harley explaining this. And again, this is a program which, if you're coming in bits and pieces, you would have no idea that this is a program to show the history of Robert Mueller's treason, if you will, and his connection with the deep state and other nefarious operations that have undermined undermined what we all believe is the judicial system of the United States. But he has been the guy they call in, along with Chertoff and Zelikow, and sometimes Lee Hamilton, to cover up for guilty people in very high places. And you can usually trace that activity back to Robert Mueller and the people who have put him in charge. So one of his activities right now, and that's what we're talking about at the moment, is trying to get something out of Papadopoulos that will bring down Trump. And we're wondering whether this is a sting, because Papadopoulos seems so shallow in his knowledge and his and his history. And
the story, Jim, is such a fraud on the face of it, and this gets to the heart of how Mueller operates. There are two parts of this that Mueller is involved in, because Papadopoulos, and we don't know yet how he ended up on the Trump Foreign Policy Advisory Committee, but this is when there was pressure. Who are your advisors? Who's talking to you? And so somebody pulled together a list of names, and this guy ended up on it. But he only attended one meeting. But he started bombarding Trump officials with emails saying he has a Russian connection. He even said in one of them, Putin wants to set up a face-to-face meeting. In others, he said he was meeting with Putin's niece. It turns out this woman, whoever she was, certainly wasn't Putin's niece. He claimed that a professor, Mifsud, who he met in London, was going to connect him with people in the Kremlin, and that he had emails with dirt on Hillary. Mifsud has said that he never said anything of the sort to Papadopoulos. This is a story he made up. But what happened was that Mueller saw him as a weak link. And Mueller obviously had, from wiretapping, surveillance, or whatever else they were using, and this will bring us back to Manafort in a second, that they had evidence that this guy was trying to convince Trump people to meet with the Russians. Now, there are at least 3 instances where he was publicly told not to try this. One was by Manafort, who said, we're not going this way. Another was Jeff Sessions. And the third was a spokesman for Trump who said, well, keep up the good work, but we're not going to do this. But he kept pushing it. And he ended up, therefore, on Mueller's radar screen. And it's likely that going back to April or May of this year, he's been wired. Wherever he goes, whoever he talks to, they're trying to get him to implicate someone else. Now, when he was finally arrested, when the plea was announced last week, they had to admit that so far the only thing they have on him is that he lied to the FBI. Well, apparently he lied to everyone. But what's important about this? They're trying to say that this is evidence that Trump wanted connections with Russia. Now, this is where the Manafort thing comes in. Manafort actually is someone of some substance. He was a key campaign official for Jerry Ford, for Reagan twice, for George H.W. Bush, although he now says that was the worst decision he ever made. And he was brought in to the Trump campaign by his old partner, Roger Stone, from Manafort, Black & Stone consulting firm. Actually, the fourth person in that firm was the infamous Lee Atwater. Now, Manafort, beginning in the new century, was making money as a political consultant. And one of the people he picked up as a client was Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. And he was hired by the Party of the Regions, which was Yanukovych's party. Now, it's clear he was paid a lot of money, but he wasn't a lobbyist in the United States for Ukraine. He was a political advisor to Yanukovych, who helped Yanukovych win the election in 2010. And he was involved in helping to shape the policy of Ukraine. Now, one of the reasons they're targeting Manafort is that he knows the state of corruption of the current government in Ukraine, the coup government, the Poroshenko regime. And he has a lot of information on that. By the way, he was the one at the Republican convention in 2016 who got Trump to shut down the attempt by McCain and others to put language into the platform supporting providing lethal weapons to the Kiev regime. So Manafort, on his own, was opposing this regime change operation. Now, he's also someone who spends a lot of money, who's somewhat extravagant. So he makes a perfect target for Mueller. And so Mueller went back and is now claiming tax evasion, unregistered lobbying, and all sorts of things, trying to flip Manafort so that Manafort will lie about working with Trump to collude with Russia. And I am personally familiar with someone who's very close to Manafort, who told me last night that Manafort will fight this to the death, that he's a man of honor, and he's not going to lie or bear false witness to protect himself from Mueller. Now, remember, toward the end of July of this year, the FBI did a pre-dawn raid of Manafort's apartment in Washington, D.C. He picked the lock, they broke in, he and his wife were in bed, and they went in and stole documents, which Manafort said were copies of documents he had already turned in. And he was told at the time, don't leave the country, you're probably going to be indicted. So they've tried to conduct a reign of terror against him and his associate Rick Gates, get them to plead to something that didn't happen. So they, on Monday of this week, Mueller, in typical fashion, unsealed the indictments after announcing on Friday that there would be indictments on Monday. So the media was going crazy all weekend. And then at the same time, they released the Papadopoulos plea bargain. And the media ate it up, saying, here's the guy who was involved on the ground in getting the Russian connection for Trump. Now, one of the people Papadopoulos tried to get them to meet with is a guy named Sergei Milian, who happens to be one of the sources for Christopher Steele's dossier. So that shows you that Papadopoulos didn't know what he was doing. Why, if he's working for Trump, why would he be meeting with someone who at the same time was providing the gossip that went into Christopher Steele's dossier? And so that's why we raised the question, is he part of a sting operation, or is he just an unwitting dupe being used by the FBI and British intelligence?
You know what we need to do? I need to make a graph, and we could collaborate on that graph and do another program where we have arrows pointing to the relationship between Mueller and these supposed witnesses that he has, and then their connections to people who are trying to undermine Trump, because this is a very difficult thing for people to follow on the radio, and we can also let people know about the dossier, and I can send anyone the dossier who wants it, and I imagine they can go to the LaRouche PAC and get it as well. And other people have asked to see you, and I'll repeat that Harley Schlanger is on at the beginning, but we had problems with the audio and the video, and so we got rid of Skype and are doing it on the phone right now. But we'll do another interview.
Jim, it's better for people to hear me than to just see me.
That's for sure. And as complicated as it is, I hope we can stay with this, and then by the time we finish, we will do a synopsis and connect Robert Mueller to a number of nefarious cover-ups. And my interest in him starting, well over a month ago, was that Trump has allowed a traitor to undermine Trump's campaign. And I thought back to, Kennedy and Truman and people who would have, dragged this guy into prison, because everybody knows what what Mueller did on 9/11. He undermined 3 investigations: the Colleen Rowley investigation, the Ken Williams investigation, which I believe was in Chicago, or was that in Arizona, and the Phoenix memo in Arizona. So those were 3 different FBI agents who picked up information before 9/11, before the 9/11 attacks, and those 3 bits of information matched, and that would have curtailed, or it would have seriously undermined the 9/11 attacks, because it would have brought to light certain players that weren't supposed to come to light. And probably
on that same point, there's a very good movie by Oliver Stone called The Good American, Bill Binney.
Oh yeah, it's just coming out.
Binney was the special technical expert at the National Security Agency, who was the one who devised a project that would have allowed the NSA, without surveilling the whole country, to have access to data on these terrorist networks that were operating. Not only was that shut down for a more expensive and more comprehensive program that targets everyone, but Binney was threatened with, he was fired, he was he was a whistleblower who was one of the many whistleblowers targeted by Mueller, and especially later on, Mueller in cooperation with the Obama administration, targeting whistleblowers.
Yes.
So this guy, and as we said at the very beginning of the program, he was first brought in by the FBI to run an operation against Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s. One of the things that people who don't like Trump say is that Trump is a less articulate, less intellectual version of LaRouche in terms of wanting to work with Russia and China, build infrastructure, and take on Wall Street. Now, I just to complete I would make this offer to your listeners. I just wrote an article that goes through some of the background on the Manafort case and the Papadopoulos case. And if people would like to get a copy of that, they could email me, and I'll be happy to send it out. Because this is crucial that people understand in real time that we're seeing a regime change coup in the United States. And it has several aspects. The first of them is the Mueller investigation to try and develop impeachable crimes. But at the same time, the same people are arguing that the 25th Amendment must be applied, that Trump is incompetent, incapable, dangerous, and they're trying to convince General Mattis, General Kelly, General McMaster, and a few other cabinet members to go to Mike Pence and say, we have to lock Trump up and make you president under the 25th Amendment. There's a whole series of articles. Vanity Fair covered it. There's a book. I think it's called. There's a book that just came out on the importance of doing a psychological evaluation of Trump and finding that he's insane. So they're trying to nullify the 2016 election because it went against what they wanted. And just one final point, Jim, before we come back to a summary, I think is important. Why did Trump win the election? It was partly that he was talking about things like free trade agreements, getting rid of them, rebuilding infrastructure, working with the Russians, that people wanted. The American people were tired of war, and they saw in Hillary someone who was completely out of touch, who was promoting the line that the Obama recovery had worked and it had helped Americans when the vast majority of people who lost their life savings or huge amounts of their life savings with the 2008 collapse have not recovered. People who lost industrial jobs in the Midwest are now working 2 or 3 jobs, temporary, part-time, low-wage jobs. And Hillary was you didn't need the Russians to win it for Trump. Hillary won it for Trump. But instead of acknowledging that, they're looking for the boogeyman. And I saw Roger Stone the other day. He said, this is a new McCarthyism, that if you're not in favor of war with Russia, then you're suspect of being a traitor to the United States. And that's really the playbook that's being used to go after Trump.
Well, I spoke with David Ray Griffin recently on the air, and we kind of jokingly called people like Chertoff and Zelikow and Mueller super patriots because they're so loyal to the deep state. They're so loyal to Wall Street that the concept of the Constitution is utterly irrelevant to them. It's laughable to them.
That's right.
So,
and not only that, they'll bend the Constitution to their own ends, but virtually the actions that they carry out are unconstitutional. There was an article written in one of the law journals recently by a former appellate court judge in Texas who said that Mueller's standard practice is what can be called prosecutorial misconduct. His chief hunt dog, Andrew Weissman, has had most of his cases thrown out of court in New York because of his overzealousness, his attempt to bully witnesses. One of the things Weissman is known for is threatening to indict the wife of people he's investigating in white-collar crimes by saying that they must have known what their husband was up to. And so when you start threatening the wife and the family in these cases, you get plea bargains. And in the case of Manafort, that's what they're hoping for. But I hope my friend is right that Manafort is going to fight this out, and that we can get the story out. And it should be added, look at the timing of this. Trump leaves today to go to Asia. The central meeting of his Asia trip is going to be with Xi Jinping. Trump has said he and Xi Jinping get along. Xi Jinping said he is looking forward to this meeting because the Chinese would like the United States to participate with them in their great global infrastructure project called the Belt and Road Initiative. And obviously, I think there was some thinking that perhaps if you put enough pressure on Trump with these indictments, maybe he'll cancel the trip. David Gergen even said that on CNN the other day, that Trump shouldn't go. But as far as I know, Trump is going. It's important that he go, and that he show that he's not going to allow himself to be bludgeoned and bullied by the deep state, which he took on during his election campaign. He took on the Bushes and the Clintons in a very effective way.
Well, since you've brought up the bullying idea, many people that I know feel that he has indeed capitulated to the neocons in so many respects. But this trip to China looks like he may have been capitulating on relatively minor issues. I mean, they're not minor if you're affected by them, but relatively minor issues in order to bring his administration on board with what's happening in Russia and China and Iran and really stopping World War III. So do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that as one who's been watching this very closely, I would have to say that Trump has not been allowed to do anything that he really set out to do, because from day one he's been forced to combat the slander that he's a Putin puppet. And, you know, the fact that he met with Putin at the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany, was an act of courage, because he not only met with him, he had an extra long talk with him. He's probably going to meet with Putin again also on the sidelines of one of these conferences in the Asia trip. So I think you're right. On the broad strategic issues, he's tried to stay consistent. But, you know, the effect of saying that if he's friendly with Putin, it's because Putin got him elected, that's the most vicious kind of blackmail, because it says to him, don't try to talk to Putin, because if you do, we'll suspect that you're paying him back for his not releasing the sexual blackmail files.
Well, one other programs that I've done, you can see I've pulled my hair out over this, is that it's perfectly okay for Netanyahu to get you elected and for Congress to sign an allegiance to Israel and for Israel to dictate who gets relief money from the flood. That's okay. Can you imagine any other country except maybe England where they could actually dictate that kind of policy, actually choose who gets elected and who gets run out, like Cynthia McKinney was run out, and she blames it on Israel. Well, she doesn't blame it wholly on Israel. She blames it on the Democratic Party that has to kowtow to Israel. So
you mentioned the other country that does that, and that's Great Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look back over the period from George H.W. Bush, first Iraq War, he was initially not so interested in going to war, and Maggie Thatcher claimed that she stiffened his spine led to the initial war. Then look at the role of Blair with W. Bush. Now, W. intended to go to war with Saddam, but the Blair dossier on weapons of mass destruction, the yellow cake uranium, all of these things came out of Britain.
Yes.
And the Gaddafi, the overthrow of Gaddafi, that was run by Cameron. So British intelligence has an extremely powerful role with the deep state, and that's directly related to the interrelationship of the City of London financial system and Wall Street. And the Israelis are a part of that, a very important part of that. And recently Ukraine has been brought in because of the importance of Ukrainian connection to Russian intelligence and Russian defense sector.
Well, there's another country I just thought of which also gets a pass, which is Turkey. The Turkish Council is one of the largest lobbyists in Washington, and they tend to get what they want as well. So the idea that, the U.S. can meddle in every election on the planet, and Israel, Britain, and Turkey can meddle in elections in the United States, but you can't even talk to Putin. What interested me there was, if I'm the average American, I think I would say, well, why wouldn't he talk to Putin? What in the world is wrong with talking to Putin? What's wrong with creating economic relationships with Putin? What's wrong with any of this stuff?
Instead, what are we doing? We're carrying out sanctions that American firms are evading, but European firms have been very badly hurt. And, I'm here in Germany, and I can tell you that Merkel has functioned as a subordinate to this Anglo-American or this transatlantic operation. But German industry and German entrepreneurs and small and medium enterprises are anxious to break out from under it. Now, one final point, and I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes, but one final point of optimism, going back to the China question. What the Chinese have done is extraordinary. They've lifted 700 million people out of poverty in 2 decades. At their recent party congress, Xi Jinping said that by 2020, they're going to lift the last 40 million people who are under the poverty level, lift them above the poverty level. Now, China has the same number of people in the level below the poverty level as the United States, and their country is 4 times larger. We have policies in this country that are destroying the middle class, that are ensuring that poor people live short, miserable lives. But what the Chinese have done with emphasis on infrastructure, state credit, and now the win-win proposal of collaboration with other countries has become unstoppable. The only way to stop it is with war. And I think Trump is aware enough of these contracts that are going out. People like the CEO of Caterpillar just came back from China and gave a raving review that China is where the future is, whether it's with internet connection, whether it's high-speed rail, their educational system, which is turning out 10 times the number of scientists and engineers that we are. In fact, a lot of their scientists and engineers are filling spots in American universities. So, the future is if you had the U.S., Russia, and China in a collaboration, you could have an era of peace, a new paradigm, a new economic paradigm, as Mrs. LaRouche has called it. And that's what the neocons, the neoliberals, the Wall Street crowd, the establishment, the trilaterals, whatever you want to call them, they don't want a new paradigm. Because the new paradigm would start with devaluing their assets. The trillions of dollars of derivative obligations on the banks, the books of banks, which we are paying for with quantitative easing and with the tax policies and everything else. If that changed, the world would be different and the deep state could be defeated. Now, whether Trump has it in him to do that or not, I think he's made some very bad decisions in some of his appointments. But I think you're right. If he keeps his eye on the ball on this China trip and doesn't get distracted by people saying you have to be tougher with China on North Korea. You know, one day he praises China for what they're doing with North Korea. The next day, some general tells him, trading with North Korea, you got to be tough on them. If he and Xi Jinping continue their relationship, and if he and Putin are able to talk, I think we have the ability to defeat the deep state. But the American people have to speak out also, and have to be clear that we don't want another era dominated by the Bushes and the Clintons.
Okay. Well, the reason I'm doing this particular program is to let people know that Mueller could be a linchpin in all of this. And if we can get the word out that he is actually a traitor and he earned his bones, is that the mafia expression?
Yeah.
He earned his bones by treasonous activity many times over. And 9/11 was the big one, which was published. I mean, everybody knows what he did on 9/11, but then he was promoted, as were Frasca and the other people who played the same game that Mueller did. So is there anything we can do, I mean, hopefully getting this out and doing another one about this, to shake the public misconception of Mueller that's been put out there by Brennan and that idiot Clapper? How do we get people aggravated and motivated to say enough with Robert Mueller? He's a traitor, a criminal, and he let people off on the BCCI scandal, and 8 people were murdered as a result of their trying to be witnesses to the BCCI scandal. That's Robert Mueller. So I'd like to kind of raise the public consciousness of this criminal who seems to be the darling of the media at this point.
Well, I think that what you're doing is crucial, because what we've got to do is get people to talk about these things and not be afraid. Not be afraid that you're going to be seen as going against the general public opinion, because most people don't know enough about these things, and we really need to educate people so that we have American citizens who can speak knowledgeably about who hijacked our country. So I would recommend that people go to LaRouchePAC.com, where you can download the Mueller dossier. It's about about 30 pages.
Yeah.
Chock full of information, but we take these 3 case studies and demonstrate that this guy has been a criminal defending the deep state operations going back to the early 80s.
Okay.
And if people want to be in touch with me and would like to get the articles that I've been writing, because I've been covering this week after week, you can send me an email at my personal email address, and I will answer you. I'll send you the article I just wrote on desperate Mueller move. I can't even remember.
Okay. Well, I'll post your email on my Facebook page.
Okay. So it's harleysch@gmail.com. So it's Harley like the motorcycle, sch@gmail.com. And I'll get back to you pretty quickly.
Oh, okay, because I have a different email for you, so I won't post the other one. Okay, harleysch
@gmail.
@gmail.com. Okay. And folks, and Harley, this book covers Mueller's covering up for the big boys at the BCCI scandal. The big wedding. I'm probably backwards for you. And that's by Sander Hicks. So Harley has the goods on Mueller, and Sander Hicks had the goods many years ago in the big wedding. So thank you very much, Harley. We'll stay in touch, and we'll try to do another version of this, a shorter version maybe, when we've got the technology really running properly.
Skype, yeah, we'll make it work for us.
Yeah, okay.
All right, Jim. Pleasure talking with you again.
You too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. So, folks, that was Harley Schlanger, and I will post this on the Facebook page, and then hopefully, if it's not too messed up, if the volume is okay, we will put it up on YouTube. So thank you very much for your interest in being there, and you can tell your friends that it will be up to study, because there are an awful lot of characters involved in this story. It's like a novel by Dickens. Okay. Bye-bye.